Maya never expected her life to change when she was assigned to care for a billionaire in a coma. Day after day, she bathed him, spoke to him, and nurtured him like he could hear. But when Ethan suddenly woke up, his first words changed everything, and so did his heart. A hospital room filled with silence. A dim lamp flickered in the private hospital suite. The scent of antiseptic lingered in the air, blending with the soft hum of the heart monitor that beeped steadily, marking the presence of life, a life that had been trapped in an endless slumber for 6 long months. Maya Evans adjusted the white bedsheet over the still body of Ethan Blackwood, her hands moving with the practiced care of a nurse, yet carrying the tenderness of someone who had come to feel something far deeper for the man lying in front of her. A billionaire, a man the world had forgotten, a man who had no one left. She sighed, pulling up a chair beside the bed. He looked so peaceful, yet so tragically alone. His sharp jawline, dusted with faint stubble, his dark lashes resting against his cheekbones, and the slight crease on his forehead, all of it made him look like he was locked in a dream he couldn't escape. Maya had seen many coma patients in her years of nursing, but Ethan was different. She felt it the very first time she stepped into this room, on the first day of her shift at this elite hospital. A heart that refused to let go, Mr. Blackwood, she whispered, as if hoping he could hear her. It's another quiet night, just you and me. No response, of course. There never was, but she spoke to him anyway. Why? Because somewhere deep inside, she felt he wasn't truly gone. The senior nurses had called her foolish. Coma patients are like empty shells, Maya. Don't get attached. He's just another rich man whose fate was sealed the moment he crashed his car. But she couldn't believe that. Every night she read to him, books she loved, sometimes even business magazines, about the empire he once ran, hoping to ignite a spark inside his subconscious. Every night she played soft piano music, having discovered from his file that he had once been a pianist before stepping into the ruthless world of business. And every night she held his hand for just a few seconds, silently praying he would squeeze it back. The ritual of care, a moment of intimacy, tonight was like every other night, except it wasn't. Maya filled a small basin with warm water, her movements slow, almost reverent. She dipped a soft cloth into it, wrung out the excess water, and gently pressed it against his hand, cleaning his fingers one by one. His hands were strong, yet there were faint scars across his knuckles, evidence of a life lived with both privilege and pain. As she ran the cloth over his arms, her gaze softened. "What kind of man were you, Ethan Blackwood?" she murmured. The world knew him as a ruthless billionaire, a man who conquered industries, but here, in this quiet hospital room, he was just a lost soul who had no one to fight for him. She continued her gentle strokes, moving up toward his shoulders, careful and precise. A part of her hated how natural this felt. Why was she so drawn to him? A whisper that changed everything. Maya reached out, brushing a damp cloth against his cheek, wiping away the faint shadow of stubble. And then, on impulse, she leaned down, her lips inches from his ear, and whispered, "You are not alone." A second of silence, then suddenly, the heart monitor spiked. Maya's hands froze, a chill ran down her spine. She quickly looked at the screen. His heart rate had increased, not dangerously, but noticeably. Her pulse quickened. Was it a coincidence? She swallowed hard, her fingers trembling, as she reached out and held his hand. "Ethan, can you hear me?" No response, but her heart told her otherwise. For the first time, she felt that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as lost as everyone thought. An unseen bond, or a love that once was. Maya took a shaky breath, her fingers still wrapped around his, and she didn't notice the way Ethan's eyelids fluttered, or the way his fingers twitched, just slightly, as if trying to hold on to the warmth of her touch. Something was happening, something that no one could explain, something that had started the moment she whispered those words. A storm brewing outside, and within the hospital, was eerily quiet that night. Outside, rain tapped softly against the window, the occasional rumble of thunder echoing through the city. Inside, the dim light cast soft shadows across Ethan Blackwood's still form. Maya sat beside him, her hands clasped together in silent thought. She had seen something tonight, something impossible. The spike on the heart monitor, the twitch of his fingers, the way the air between them had suddenly felt alive. Her rational mind told her it was nothing, just a reflex. But her heart told her something was changing. She inhaled deeply and reached out, gently taking Ethan's hand in hers. It was warm, solid, real. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice carrying the kind of longing she didn't fully understand. "If you can hear me, if you're trapped somewhere in the darkness, I need you to fight." Thunder rumbled outside, and as if responding to her whoosh, his fingers twitched again. Maya gasped. This time, she was sure she hadn't imagined it. A heartbeat that called out to her. She leaned closer, her pulse racing. "Ethan," she whispered, barely able to breathe. Nothing. But then the heart monitor beeped faster, her breath hitched, her fingers tightened around his. This was not a coincidence. It couldn't be. She felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest, something she didn't dare name. Hope. Carefully she brought his hand up, pressing it lightly against her cheek. "You're not alone," she whispered again, repeating the words that had made something inside him stir. Outside, the storm raged, but inside, in this quiet room, something miraculous was beginning. The moment everything changed. Then it happened. A sharp inhale. Maya's heart stopped. She sat frozen, as she saw his chest rise and fall differently this time. A deep, ragged breath. As if someone who had been drowning had finally found air. Then slowly, painfully, his eyelids fluttered. Maya felt the world tilt beneath her feet, and then Ethan Blackwood's eyes opened. They were deep, intense, a stormy shade of grey that mirrored the sky outside. For the first time in 6 months, those eyes looked up at her, confused, searching, desperate for something. Maya felt as though the air had been stolen from her lungs. This wasn't just a patient waking up, this was something far bigger, something fate had written long before this moment. A billionaire's first word, and a connection that shouldn't exist. Ethan blinked slowly, his gaze unfocused, as if waking from a dream he had been trapped in for too long. His lips parted, cracked and dry, and he tried to speak. Maya immediately reached for a glass of water, gently pressing it to his lips. "Take it slow," she whispered, her voice trembling. He drank a little, then exhaled shakily. His fingers twitched against the bedsheet. Then his eyes locked onto hers. And then he spoke. "Who are you?" Maya felt her heart slam against her ribs. Not because of what he asked, but because of what came next. Ethan's brows furrowed slightly, as if something deep inside him was trying to remember. His lips parted again, and he whispered something that made Maya's blood turn to ice. "I know you." A chill ran down her spine. She felt her hands start to tremble. That was impossible. They had never met before, had they? The mystery deepens. A love lost in time. Before she could ask, his body tensed. His breathing became uneven, his pulse spiking erratically on the monitor. "Ethan, Ethan, stay with me," she pleaded. His fingers gripped the bedsheet tightly, his jaw clenching. Then before Maya could do anything, his body went still again. Not like before, not lifeless, just unconscious, as if waking up had drained him completely. Maya collapsed into the chair, her heart pounding. He had woken up, he had spoken, and most terrifying of all, he had looked at her as if he had loved her once before. The weight of silence. The morning light filtered softly through the hospital blinds, casting golden streaks over the sterile white walls. The world outside bustled with life, but inside Ethan Blackwood's private hospital room, time felt frozen. Maya sat beside him, Her fingers curled into the fabric of her scrubs as she watched the slow rise and fall of his chest. He was awake, he had spoken, and yet the weight of his last words still clung to her. I know you. How her pounded as she replayed the moment over and over. She had never met him before, not in this life, not in any way that made sense. Then why had his storm-gray eyes locked onto hers with such raw intensity? She exhaled shakily, pushing back the overwhelming emotions creeping into her chest. Right now, none of that mattered. Right now, he needed her. Ethan's awakening, and the fear in his eyes. A soft groan broke the silence. Maya straightened, her breath catching as she watched his fingers twitch against the blanket. Then with a slow, pained inhale, Ethan's eyes fluttered open, stormy gray, unfocused, filled with an exhaustion that ran far deeper than physical fatigue. Maya leaned forward, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan, can you hear me? His brow furrowed, a flicker of confusion passing over his features. Then his gaze locked onto hers, a sharp, piercing gaze that made her heart stop. Seconds stretched between them, charged with something she couldn't name. Then slowly, he parted his lips. Where am I? Maya swallowed hard. You're in Blackwood Medical Center. You've been in a coma for 6 months. His breathing hitched, his hands gripped the bedsheet. 6 months. His voice was hoarse, disbelief laced in every syllable. Maya nodded. You were in an accident, a car crash. Your body survived, but she hesitated, choosing her words carefully.
You never woke up.
Until now, she expected relief, gratitude, something, but instead his face twisted with something close to panic. His hand shot up to his temple, as if his head ached. His jaw clenched, then finally, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, I don't remember. A mind in darkness, a heart that remembers. Maya felt her breath leave her. You don't remember what? She asked hesitantly. Ethan's throat bobbed, his fingers tightened in the sheets. His voice was strained, hoarse with the weight of something heavy. Anything. Silence. A silence so thick it pressed against Maya's ribs. Her fingers curled against her lap as she processed his words. Ethan Blackwood, the billionaire who once ruled empires, who had the world at his feet, didn't even remember his own name. The devastation in his eyes. I don't, he exhaled sharply, his frustration raw. I don't remember my life, my past. I don't even remember how I got here. His hands trembled as he dragged them through his thick tousled hair. I should know things, my family, my work, my name, but it's just, his voice broke slightly. It's just darkness. Maya felt an ache settle deep in her chest. This wasn't just a patient's recovery. This was a man stripped of his identity, lost in his own mind. She wanted to say something comforting, something that would ease the agony she saw written across his face. But before she could speak, his gaze lifted to hers again, and that look in his eyes, it was the only thing that wasn't blank. It was searching, desperate, and it sent a shiver down Maya's spine, because it was filled with something strangely familiar. He may have forgotten his world, but somehow he hadn't forgotten her. The first touch, and a connection that shouldn't exist. A shaky breath left Ethan's lips. His fingers curled against the hospital sheets, and for a moment, he seemed lost in thought. Then slowly, almost instinctively, he reached out. Maya didn't move. She knew she should pull back, remind herself that this was a professional setting. But when his fingertips brushed against hers, something electric passed between them. A spark, a memory that didn't exist, a feeling that shouldn't have been there. Ethan inhaled sharply, his fingers twitching as if testing the reality of her touch. Then in a voice so soft it almost shattered her, why do I feel like I know you? Maya's heart pounded against her ribs, because she didn't have an answer. But she felt it too. The unraveling mystery of their hearts. Ethan's hand lingered over hers for just a second longer. Then exhaustion pulled at his body once more. His eyelids drooped, his breathing evening out as sleep reclaimed him. But Maya sat frozen, because something inside her had changed. She had spent 6 months talking to him, taking care of him, feeling something she couldn't explain. And now, he had woken up and looked at her like she was the only piece of his past he could remember. A restless heart, and an unspoken connection. The soft beeping of the heart monitor filled the room, steady and rhythmic. The storm outside had passed, but inside Maid's heart, a new kind of storm was brewing. Ethan was sleeping again, his breaths even but troubled. His body had woken up, but his mind was lost in a void of forgotten memory. And yet the way he had looked at her, as if she was the only thing familiar in his world of darkness, still sent shivers down her spine. Maya sat beside him, unable to pull herself away. Why did he say he knew her? Was it just his mind latching on to the first person he saw? Or did something deeper, something unexplainable, exist between them? She sighed and gently reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. His skin was warm under her touch, and an unfamiliar feeling tugged at her heart. She had cared for him for 6 months, but now he was looking at her like she was more than just his nurse, and that terrified her. A man searching for himself, Ethan stirred, a soft groan escaping his lips. His lashes fluttered before his storm-grey eyes opened, still clouded with exhaustion. For a moment he stared at the ceiling, confusion flickering over his face. Then his gaze found hers. Maya swallowed. "You're awake." His throat bobbed as he swallowed, his voice rough. "I had the strangest dream." She hesitated. "What kind of dream?" Ethan exhaled, his fingers twitching slightly against the sheets. "I was searching for something, or someone. It felt like I was lost in a place where nothing existed, just emptiness." And then his brows furrowed. "Then I heard your voice." Maya's breath hitched. "My voice?" He nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. "It was pulling me back, like an anchor." Her fingers tightened around the blanket. This was impossible. But before she could respond, Ethan suddenly reached for her hand. His grip was gentle but firm, as if he needed to feel something real. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Why does it feel like I've known you?" Maya's pulse pounded in her ears. "Ethan, I..." Before she could finish, the door swung open. A billionaire's forgotten life returned. One piece at a time, Dr. Patel, Ethan's lead physician, entered with a professional but relieved smile. "Mr. Blackwood, you have no idea how good it is to see you awake." Ethan blinked, his expression shifting to uncertainty. Patel continued, "Your body has made an incredible recovery, but we need to assess your cognitive functions. Can you tell me your full name?" Ethan hesitated, his jaw clenched, his fingers twitching around Maya's. Then finally, he exhaled, frustration thick in his voice. Maya's heart ached at the helplessness in his tone. Dr. Patel nodded patiently. "That's okay. Memory loss after a prolonged coma is common. Let's try something else. Do you know where you are?" Ethan shook his head. "No." Dr. Patel flipped through his clipboard. "Do you remember your family?" Another pause. Ethan's brows knitted together, his breathing turning uneven. Then finally, he shook his head again. "No, I don't remember anything." Maya's chest tightened. Ethan was just lost in his past. His past was lost to him, a choice that changes everything. Dr. Patel sighed and turned to Maya. "We'll need to take this slow. He'll need physical therapy, cognitive exercise, and someone to help him readjust." Maya stiffened. "You mean a nurse?" Dr. Patel shook his head. "More than that, he needs stability, familiarity. He needs someone who can help him rebuild." He turned to Ethan. "You'll need a personal caregiver." Ethan's storm-grey eyes drifted to Maya. There was no logic to it, no reason, but something inside him felt like she was the answer. "I want her," he said suddenly. Maya's breath caught. "What?" Ethan's fingers curled slightly in the sheets. "I don't know why, but I trust you." His words knocked the air from her lungs. She wasn't expecting this. She wasn't expecting to become more than just his nurse. But when she looked into his eyes, the eyes of a man who had forgotten the world but still held on to her. She knew she couldn't walk away. A moment that shouldn't feel this intimate after Dr. Patel left. The room felt smaller, tighter. Ethan watched Maya carefully, studying every little movement, as if trying to memorize her, instead of the life he had lost. "Are you okay?" he asked, voice soft and dull. Maya forced a smile. "I should be asking you that." Ethan tilted his head slightly, still watching her. "I don't remember my life, my name, my family, but when I look at you, I feel like I'm supposed to know you." Maya swallowed hard, because the way he looked at her, it was the way a man looked at someone he had once loved, an unbreakable thread between two strangers. That night, long after Ethan had fallen asleep again, Maya sat by his bedside. She could have gone home, could have let another nurse take over, but she didn't. Instead, she sat in the quiet, her eyes tracing the strong lines of Ethan's face, the gentle rise and fall of his chest. And for the first time, she allowed herself to admit the truth. She had been talking to him for 6 months. She had been holding his hand, telling him stories, whispering to him in the dark. And now that he was awake, she wasn't ready to let go. Somehow, impossibly, she felt like she belonged to him, even if he didn't remember why. A new beginning in an unknown life. Ethan Blackwood had woken up as a stranger to his own life. His name, his past, his family, everything had vanished into the void of his forgotten memories. And yet in that empty world, Maya was the only familiar presence. She had been there, whispering to him in the dark, guiding him back to life. And now, even though he couldn't explain, he didn't want to let her go. The first steps toward recovery. The following morning, Maya arrived at his hospital room, balancing a tray of breakfast. Ethan was awake, staring out the window, his broad shoulders tense. The storm-gray eyes that had once held the confidence of a billionaire now carried something else entirely. Loss. She hesitated. "Good morning." He turned to her, his expression softening. "It is Nell." Maya's breath hitched, her heart skipping a beat. Why does he say things like that? She cleared her throat and placed the tray on his bedside table. "Dr. Patel says, you need to regain your strength, so you're on a strict diet." Ethan looked at the food, a bland mix of oatmeal and fruit and cider. "I was hoping for steak." Maya laughed, shaking her hairs. "You have to learn how to walk again before you start making demands." Ethan smirked. "Then I guess I'll have to impress you." Something about the way he said it, teasing, flirtatious, yet filled with a raw sincerity, made her heart stutter. She wasn't sure if he was always like this, or if some part of him, deep down, had always been drawn to her. A touch that means more than it should. After breakfast, the physical therapist arrived. Maya stood by, watching as Ethan took his first steps in 6 months. His legs were weak, his body unsteady, but he refused to give up. His jaw clenched with determination, sweat forming at his brow. Halfway across the room, his knees buckled, he stumbled, and before the therapist could react, Maya rushed forward, catching him, her arms wrapped around his waist, steadying him. His hand instinctively gripped her shoulder. They were close, too close. Ethan's breathing was heavy, his forehead nearly touching her. Maya could feel the warmth of his skin, the way his fingers trembled against her. And then his voice, low and husky. "You won't let me fall, will you?" Maya swallowed, her heart racing. "Never." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The world disappeared. It was just his heart against hers, his warmth against her skin, his gaze searching hers for something he couldn't name. Then, with visible effort, Ethan straightened, stepping back, but he didn't let go of her hand, and Maya didn't pull away. The first glimpse of a forgotten life lay. That evening, Ethan sat on his hospital bed, flipping through a photo album Dr. Patel had brought him. Each picture showed a glimpse of his past, a life he no longer recognized. Expensive suits, lavish party, a penthouse overlooking the city. But none of it felt real. None of it felt like him. Maya sat beside him, her presence grounding him. He exhaled. I look at these photos, and it's like I'm staring at a strange. She hesitated. Maybe you don't have to rush to remember who you were. Maybe you can just focus on who you are now. Ethan turned to her, his storm gray eyes softening. And who am I now, Maya? Her breath caught. Why does he say her name like that? Like it means something more. She swallowed hard. You're someone who's fighting. Someone who's learning to live again. You're not lost, Ethan. You're just finding your way back. Ethan's gaze never left hers. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for her hand. His fingers brushed against hers. Gentle, tentative. Then maybe you can help me find my way. Maya's heart pounded. She should have told him that this was just professional, that she was just his nurse. But the truth was, she already cared too much. And the way Ethan looked at her, with that same unshakable feeling of knowing her, maybe he cared too. A moment that changes everything that night. As Maya tucked him in, Ethan caught her wrist before she could leave. His touch was warm, his grip firm, but not forceful. His voice was barely a whisper. Will you stay? Maya me. Ethan, he exhaled, shaken. I don't know why, but when you're here, the emptiness doesn't feel so heavy. Her heart twisted. She should say no. She should walk away. But instead she pulled up a chair, sitting beside him. And when Ethan finally closed his eyes, his breathing even, he fell asleep, still holding her hand. And for the first time since he woke up, he didn't look lost anymore. The battle between memory and emotion. Ethan was recovering. Ethically, his strength was returning. His muscles no longer ached with every step, and his hands had stopped trembling when he reached for things. But inside, he was lost. The past was a blank slate. No matter how hard he tried, his memories refused to return. But when he looked at Maya, there was something there, a pull, an ache. He had known her in another life, and it was getting stronger every day. An evening under the stars. Maya had been by his side every step of the way, helping him walk, reminding him to eat, reading to him when the silence became unbearable. But tonight, as she wheeled him outside into the hospital garden for the first time, something felt different. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of roses. The stars twinkled above, their soft glow casting a silver hue over everything. Ethan exhaled, tilting his head up. It's strange, he murmured. I feel like I haven't seen the night sky in forever. Maya smiled, her chest tightening.
You haven't?
He turned to look at her, the shadows dancing across his sharp features. Then I guess it's my first time seeing it. His lips curved slightly. And I'm glad you're here. Maya's breath hitched. Why did his words feel so much deeper than they should? A touch that feels like a memory. Ethan reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. It was barely a touch, a whisper of contact, but it sent a shockwave through Maya's entire being. She should pull away. She should remind him that she was just his caregiver. But she didn't. Instead, she let her fingers intertwine with his, their hands resting between them, warm and steady. Ethan's thumb traced slow circles over her skin, and he sighed. I feel like I've held your hand before. Maya's heart slammed against her ribs. She parted her lips, about to say something, to tell him that he hadn't, that this was new. But was it? Because the way he looked at her, like she was the only thing anchoring him to reality, it felt like a memory, a forgotten love story trapped between time and lost recollections. And Maya wasn't sure if she wanted him to remember, or if she wanted to be the person he fell for all over again. The dream that changes everything. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, images flickered through his mind. A woman's laughter, the scent of jasmine, the feeling of fingers slipping through his, and a whisper, "Don't let go." He jolted awake, his breathing heavy, his heart racing. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow from the window casting shadows across the walls, and then he saw her. Maya was asleep in the chair beside him, her head resting against the edge of his bed. She had stayed. Again, his gaze softened. Why did she feel like home? Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. Maya stirred, her lashes fluttering open. Their eyes met in the quiet of the night. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then softly, Ethan whispered, "I think I'm remembering something." Maya sucked in a sharp breath. "What?" His thumb grazed over her knuckles, his touch slow, lingering. "You." Her pulse stuttered. "Ethan." His voice was barely above a whisper. "Tell me, did I love you before?" Maya's heart shattered and soared at the same time. Because the truth was, even if he hadn't loved her before, he was falling for her now. A battle between reality and the heart. Ethan's words lingered in Maya's mind long after the night had passed. "Tell me, did I love you before?" She had frozen in that moment, her heart pounding so loudly she thought he could hear it. But she hadn't answered, because the truth was complicated. No, Ethan had never loved her before, but he was falling for her now. And Maya, she was already too deep. The unspoken confession. The next morning, Ethan was different. Something had changed. He was more attentive, his gaze lingering on her longer than before. His touch, whenever their fingers brushed, whenever she helped him stand, was deliberate, hesitant, yet filled with an intensity she couldn't ignore. And then there were his words. Soft, teasing, yet always laced with something deeper. Like now, as she adjusted his IV drip. "You didn't answer me last night," Ethan murmured. Maya stilled, his storm-grey eyes searched hers, and her breath caught. "Did I love you before?" She forced a small smile, masking the storm in her chest. "You shouldn't focus on the past, Ethan. You should focus on who you are now." Ethan smirked. "And what if the man I am now is falling for you?" Her heart stuttered. "Ethan, would that be so bad?" His voice was soft, almost vulnerable. Maya swallowed hard. She had spent months by his side, caring for him, holding his hand through the darkness. And now here he was, looking at her like she was his light. How could she tell him that she wasn't meant to be his future? A memory that feels like love. Later that evening, Ethan insisted on walking outside again. The night was cool, the wind carrying the scent of jasmine, the same scent from his dream. Maya was beside him, her hands barely touching his arm, as they walked through the garden. Ethan stopped suddenly, his fingers gripping the bench beside him. Maya immediately steadied him. "Are you okay?" He closed his eyes, his brows furrowing. "I don't know. It's like, I feel something." Maya's breath hitched. "What do you feel?" His fingers flexed against hers, his touch both uncertain and desperate. "You." Her lips parted. "Ethan, I don't know why, but when I'm with you, I feel like I'm exactly where I need to be." Maya's chest tightened. She wanted to tell him the truth, that she was just his nurse, that he was confusing gratitude for something deeper. But the way he was looking at her, raw, intense, vulnerable, made it impossible. Instead she whispered, "Maybe you're not supposed to remember everything." Ethan let out a soft chuckle, his thumb brushing against her palm. "Then maybe I'll just have to make new memories with you." Maya's heart shattered and soared at the same time, because she wanted that too, desperately. A dance beneath the moonlight. The hospital was quiet that night. Most of the patients were asleep. Ethan was supposed to be too, but instead, he stood in his room, staring out the window, lost in thought. A knock at the door made him turn. Maya stood there, hesitating, a small smile on her lips. "Can't sleep?" she asked. Ethan exhaled, shaking his head. "I keep thinking about everything." Maya stepped inside, biting her lip. Then, in a moment of pure spontaneity, she took out her phone and played a soft melody. Ethan raised a brow. "Are we having a midnight concert?" Maya laughed. "No, we're dancing." Ethan's smirk faltered. He hadn't danced in 6 months. His body was still weak, but when Maya extended her hand toward him, something in him trusted her, so he took it. Slowly, gently, She guided him into a slow sway. His hands rested lightly on her waist. Hers gripped his shoulders. They were too close, too much, too intoxicating. Maya's breath was uneven. She knew this was dangerous. She was just a nurse. He was just a patient. And yet, nothing about this felt like a mistake. Ethan's forehead brushed against hers, his breath warm against her skin. And then he whispered it. I don't know if I loved you before, Maya. His fingers tightened on her waist. But I think I love you now. Maya's entire world stopped. Her heart screamed at her to say something, to confess that she felt it too. But before she could, Ethan stumbled. Maya gasped, catching him just before he collapsed. His breathing was ragged, his body weak, and in that moment, reality crashed back in. He wasn't ready, physically, emotionally, and she wasn't ready to love someone who might wake up one day and remember a different woman.
You.
So instead of saying what her heart desperately wanted to, Maya whispered, "You need to rest." She helped him back to bed, brushing his hair away from his forehead. Ethan's fingers caught hers one last time before he closed his eyes. And just as he drifted to sleep, he mumbled, "Don't let go." Maya sat beside him, gripping his hand tightly, and in the silence of the night, she realized she was already too late. She had already fallen, and she had no idea how to stop. The calm before the storm. The morning after Ethan's whispered confession, Maya felt different. Her heart was raw, aching with a love she wasn't supposed to feel. Ethan had held her close. He had told her he thought he loved her. But love built on a broken memory, could it survive the truth? She had spent months by his side, watching him heal, watching him rediscover life. And now, she was terrified. Because the moment his past returned, she knew she would lose him. And she wasn't sure if she had the strength to let go. A moment too perfect. The morning light streamed through the hospital window, as Ethan sat at the edge of his bed, stretching his arms. He looked stronger today, more alive. Maya entered the room, and their eyes met. His lips curled into a small smile. "You stayed." Maya swallowed hard, forcing a playful smirk. "I always do." He studied her, something unreadable in his gaze. "Why?" Her fingers trembled around the clipboard she was holding. Why? Because she cared too much. Because somewhere along the way, he had become more than just a patient. Because she had fallen hopelessly, desperately, irrevocably in love. But she couldn't say that. So instead she whispered, "Because you matter, Ethan." His smile softened. Then reaching forward, he took her hand in his. Her breath hitched. Ethan's fingers traced slow circles over her palm, just like the night before. "You matter too." An uninvited guest. Their moment was shattered by the sharp sound of heels clicking against the floor. Maya turned and felt her heart stop. A tall woman stood in the doorway, her dark hair cascading in elegant waves, her red lips pressed together, her eyes the same stormy gray as Ethan's locked onto him, and something flickered across her face. Pain, relief, and love. "Ethan," she whispered. Maya felt Ethan tense beside her. His fingers, which had been wrapped around hers just seconds ago, slowly loosened. Maya's stomach twisted, because she knew who this woman was. The past Ethan had been trying so hard to remember. It had just walked through the door. The ghost of a forgotten love. Ethan stared at the woman, confusion flickering in his gaze. "Who are you?" The woman sucked in a sharp breath, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Her voice broke. She swallowed, taking a hesitant step forward. "I'm Olivia." Maya felt her knees go weak. Olivia, the woman Ethan had loved before the accident, the woman he was supposed to remember, and the woman Maya could never compete with. A heartbreaking realization. Ethan's brows furrowed. He glanced at Maya, as if searching for an answer. Maya forced herself to smile, even when it felt like her entire world was shattering. "She's someone important to you," she murmured. Ethan turned back to Olivia.
You don't.
He hesitated. "I don't remember." Olivia blinked back tears. "Then let me help you." She reached into her bag, pulling out a small photo. She held it out to Ethan. He took it hesitantly, his eyes scanning the image. It was a picture of him and Olivia, standing together, laughing, wrapped in each other's arms. Maya felt sick. She shouldn't be here. She shouldn't be witnessing this. This was their story, not hers. But before she could turn away, Ethan suddenly gasped. He gripped his head, his breathing sharp and uneven. Maya's eyes widened. Ethan, what's wrong? Memories exploded in Ethan's mind. Flashes of Olivia, of laughter, of whispered promises, and then a wedding ring. A proposal. Marry me, Olivia. Maya's heart stopped. Ethan's fingers trembled as the photo slipped from his grasp. He slowly looked up, his grey eyes locking onto Olivia's, and then in a breathless whisper, Olivia, I remember. Maya felt her soul crack in half, because in that moment, she knew she had lost him, a love that was never meant to be. Maya turned away, willing herself to stay strong. This was what she had feared all along. The moment his past returned, she would become nothing more than a footnote in his story. She should leave. She should walk away before the pain swallowed her whole. But before she could take a single step, Ethan's voice stopped her. Maya, wait. She froze. He was staring at her now, something conflicted in his gaze, something desperate, like he wasn't ready to let go. Maya swallowed back the lump in her throat. You should be with her, Ethan. His brows furrowed. I don't know what I should be. Her voice cracked. But you remember her. A heavy silence stretched between them. Then in the softest whisper, I remember you too. Maya's breath hitched. Ethan took a hesitant step forward. I remember the way I felt when I woke up and saw you beside me. I remember the way you made me feel safe when I didn't even know my own name. And I remember that even before my mind could understand it, my heart already knew. His voice was barely above a whisper now. Maya, what if I don't want to remember a love that already ended? Maya's heart slammed against her ribs. Was he choosing her? Before she could speak, Olivia stepped forward, her voice trembling. Ethan, we were engaged. Maya felt the air leave her lungs. Ethan's expression darkened. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I don't know what to do. And in that moment, Maya realized Ethan was caught between two lives, two loves, and only one of them could have him. A heart divided, Ethan felt like he was drowning. One moment, he had been falling for Maya, his nurse, his savior, the woman who had breathed life into him when he had nothing but darkness. And the next, Olivia was standing in front of him, carrying the weight of the past he had forgotten. She was his fiancée. He had asked her to marry him, and yet why did it feel like his heart belonged somewhere else? He turned to Maya, but she had already taken a step back, her eyes carefully guarded. The warmth that had always existed between them was slowly slipping away, and Ethan wasn't sure if he could handle losing it. Maya's silent, goodbye, Maya, clenched her fists at her sides, forcing herself to breathe. She should have known this would happen. She should have prepared herself. Ethan was never meant to be hers. She had spent months by his side, not as his lover, but as his nurse. And now, the woman who truly belonged to him had returned. She had no right to stand in the way of that, even if it meant breaking her own heart. So she did the only thing she could. She looked at him with a soft yet painful smile. I think you need time, Ethan. His brows furrowed. Myers, she swallowed, cutting him off before he could say something that would make this even harder. You need to remember who you were before you decide who you want to be now. Her voice wavered, but she pushed through. And Maya glanced at Olivia, whose expression remained unreadable. She's the person who was with you through it all. Maybe you owe it to yourself to try and remember that love. Ethan took a step forward. But what if I don't want to? Maya's breath hitched. But before she could respond, Olivia finally spoke. Ethan, I won't force you to love me again. But before you walk away from what we had, at least give yourself a chance to remember it. Maya felt her chest tighten. Because Olivia was right, Ethan had to know the full truth before he could make a choice. And as much as it hurt, Maya wouldn't let herself be selfish. So with one last look at the man she had fallen for, she whispered, "Goodbye, Ethan." And then she walked away. A love that refuses to let go. The hospital felt emptier without her. Ethan noticed it immediately. The way the air felt colder. The way his chest felt heavier. The way the silence stretched too long without Maya's laughter filling the space. Olivia was here now. She sat beside him, holding his hand. She told him stories, stories about their past, their travels, their love, and yet, every time she spoke, he found himself looking for something that wasn't there. For someone who wasn't there. It had only been a few days since Maya left, and yet, it felt like he had lost something irreplaceable. A truth that can't be ignored. One night, Ethan sat alone in his hospital room, staring at the engagement ring Olivia had given back to him. He turned it over in his palm, his mind racing. He remembered pieces of their love. The way they had danced in the rain. The way they had kissed under city lights. The way he had once promised her forever. So why did it feel like he had already given his heart to someone else? His mind was trying to pull him back into his past. But his heart, it was pulling him toward Maya. Running back to love. Ethan made his choice. He didn't need more time. He didn't need more memories. Because love wasn't just about the past. It was about who made your heart race now. And for him that person was Maya. So he did the only thing that made sense. He ran after her. The most beautiful surprise. Maya stood outside her small apartment, staring at the city skyline. Her heart still ached, but she had accepted her fate. Ethan wasn't hers to love. But then she heard the footsteps, fast, desperate, coming toward her. She turned and gasped. Ethan was there, breathless, panting, looking at her like she was the only thing that mattered. Her eyes widened. Ethan, he took her face in his hands, and in a voice filled with raw, unshakable truth, "I remember everything." Maya's heart stopped. What? But before she could even process it, Ethan whispered, "And I still choose you." Then he kissed her. And this time, there was no more doubt, no more past, no more uncertainty, just love. Deep, fierce, unbreakable. The kind that didn't rely on memories. Because his heart had known all along.